Robert, the Director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission, and I'm here to introduce my beloved colleague, Professor John Berthrong, our Professor of Comparative Theology. It just seems like yesterday, John, when you came here. I remember that. That shows how old we've both become in service at the school. But John Berthrong is a distinguished colleague for many reasons. For one thing, he's one of our colleagues who's better known in another country than he is in the United States. John is always going back and forth to China. He has many publications both in Chinese and in English. Let me read the titles of some of them. Expanding Process, Exploring Philosophical and Theological Transformations in China and the West. Confucianism, A Short Introduction. The Divine Delhi. Transformations of the Confucian Way. Concerning Creativity, a comparison of Jushi, Whitehead, and Neville, and so on. And so, for years now, former Dean Berthrong has been teaching comparative theology. He also has been doing yeoman service in the Graduate Division of Religious Studies, and many things behind the scene that we don't all see. And upon his retirement, we'd like to just give Professor Berthrong this is one of a number of chances for him to reflect on some of the work that's most important to him. Today he'll speak about his work in Confucian Christian dialogue. So please join me in welcoming Professor John Berthrong.
Well, it's mobile. Let's move back a bit. It's a real pleasure to be here. We were just talking about, they set the room up like this for when we're having lunches. It's kind of an odd setup, but I think my voice is loud enough that I'm one of those people that I don't think you'll have trouble hearing. This is a real pleasure for me to talk about Confucian Christian dialogue, because I've talked with a couple other people on the phone already today about it, and without false modesty, I think it's fairly safe to say I'm one of the parents of Confucian Christian dialogue, and I'll explain how that came about. I always was interested in, well, actually not. I was a 19-year-old, and my father was invited to be a Fulbright professor, and in those days he was invited then to go teach at the University of Hong Kong. And so we actually piled on a boat. We didn't fly. We got on a boat. And my first memory of, well, we stopped in Hawaii and then we stopped in Japan. But I remember there was this incandescent moment, beautiful moment. It was fairly early in the morning. It must have been about 7:30. But it was one of those gorgeous days, sunny days you have in Hong Kong. And I literally sailed into Hong Kong Harbor. And that is a treat that you just don't get by flying in. I mean, here you are on this boat and you sail in and this whole majestic world opens up to you. And my very first thought as a 19-year-old from Oklahoma is, oh my God, there are probably 3 times as many people sitting there in this city in front of me and live in this huge state that I came from. Now, to fast forward a bit, I was later then hired to be the Interfaith Dialogue Secretary of the United Church of Canada, which is a terribly, wonderfully, lovely, progressive church. And as far as I know, it is still the only Protestant church in North America that actually has an Interfaith Dialogue Secretary, somebody who does Interfaith Dialogue. They actually separated, even though I worked with the ecumenical officer, but they said, no, we have an ecumenical officer whose job is primarily to work with other Christian denominations and churches, but we also want someone who works on interreligious dialogue. That is quite unique, very Canadian. The Canadian Council of Churches, the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops also did that. It's never quite interfaith dialogue has become popular in North America, popular in the United States, but it's never had that kind of gravitas that it had in Canada. Now, my background then got to be, because having sailed into Hong Kong Harbor at the age of 19, I got fascinated by Asian studies and continued to do doctoral work in Asian studies. And my area of actual specialization is Confucianism and Christianity. So I'm going to talk a fair amount about that in terms of what we did. Now, let me back up a little bit. After, all right, I'll be a teacher. Some of you you could be, this is not a trick question. Not a trick question. I always tell my classes that, and they never believe me, so they'll never say anything. I'm trying to trick them. In 1964, religiously, what major event is going on in that year in terms of world Christianity? Vatican II. Vatican II. And Vatican, the Vatican II papers actually almost as an add-on, they were always going to write a section on Judaism, which they did, which they put in amongst Christian documents, which my Jewish friends are always a little nervous. They said, on the one hand, it's a wonderful document. It really would be nice if we weren't stuck in the middle of somewhere of, the purely Christian parts. But then they had the idea of writing the second part about encouraging interfaith dialogue. So after Vatican II, they began doing that, and then the World Council of Churches and other international agencies got involved in it. I ended up moving to Canada in the early 1980s, and they had just started an office of interfaith dialogue, and the gentleman who was taking it, Jim Soonrein, unfortunately took very ill, so they decided they would hire somebody younger. And I want to honor the name of the person who I think got me the job, a wonderful woman named Kate Hawken. And the Hawken family had been missionary families for 3 generations. The United Church of Canada had always had a very strong presence in East Asia, and especially in China, and she'd been born in Shanghai. So, when she was looking for another interfaith dialogue secretary, voila, somebody with a sinological training was perfect for her to do. So, here we are. We're getting this idea, and there are already now all kinds of bilateral dialogues going on. The most famous ones, of course, would have been Christian Jewish dialogue, which goes, I don't know how far back, but the 1920s and 30s. Muslim Christian dialogue, but people were encouraged to think about doing all other kinds of interfaith dialogues. So I decided it would be fun to do a Christian, Confucian, Christian dialogue. And colleagues of mine at that point at the Chinese University of Hong Kong thought it'd be like Hong Kong was a natural place to do this. So we organized the event there. And I had read around in the literature of people who were interested in comparative theology, and I discovered this person named Robert Neville, who I had never met except by print. So I invited Robert Neville to join us at the consultation, and I didn't plan this, but they made us roommates. So I think I'm standing in front of you because Robert and I got to know each other as roommates will for 4 or 5 days together in a big hotel, and then he was then just made the dean. He was then promoted to be the dean at the School of Theology, and he called me up and said, "I need an academic dean, but I also not only just need somebody with an academic background, but I really want to expand the range of the kinds of topics and things that we teach here. So I want to get somebody in world religion, and having had such a wonderful time with you recently in Hong Kong, how would you like to come down to teach at Boston University?" So that's how I ended up here. I ended up here because of of organizing the first large Confucian Christian dialogue. Now, was that the first Confucian Christian dialogue? No. No. And in fact, it would be hard to actually say when you could pinpoint when there would be a first Confucian Christian dialogue. You might want to say, duh. I mean, how could that happen? Why would that be difficult? Well, part of it is that Western Christians tend to think of Christianity in terms of Western Europe and its development there. But now, I want you to cast your mind back to the 7th century of the Common Era, and what would have been one of the largest churches in the world, and one of the most expansive churches in the world. Doesn't somebody want to try? The Nestorians, the Nestorian church. Now, it of course has always gotten a bad press in Greek Orthodoxy and in Western Christianity, but the Nestorians were situated in the Middle East, in around Baghdad, and they spread throughout Central Asia. So we know that Nestorian Christians reached China during the Tang Dynasty. They were there by the 700s. So there was obviously, and we know there were conversations that went on between them, and we still have some of the texts. But that disappeared. The second part comes in the 13th and 14th century with the rise of the great Mongol Empire, which gets all the way to Europe. And if it hadn't been for Genghis Khan had managed to live about another decade, we all would be speaking Mongolian. No, that's a joke. But the Mongols had made it all the way to Poland, and were cheerfully, going through Europe the same way they went through everything else. They probably would have ended up in London within about another decade, but didn't. So, for practical purposes, then you find the Roman Catholic Church in the 13th and 14th century through mission activity, but we just don't know that much. We know something about what went on. But then you get to the 19th century, the 18th century and the 19th century, and then you find the massive, Professor Roberts' world, the expansion of world mission. Not only Roman Catholics who've been doing it forever and ever and ever, but now we're joined by Protestants. And by the 1960s, the churches had decided that along with more traditional forms of mission, they invented the notion of interfaith dialogue, which is actually theologically, even not in this school particularly, but is an interesting concept because people say, why do you do it? Is it just for purposes of mission? I would say that in many schools in North America, the study of interfaith dialogue has become a separate reality because people have come, at least for some people, it has led to a growing respect for the other traditions which people encounter. Now, what is interesting about current Confucian Christian dialogue, Christian Confucian dialogue, whichever way you want to put the two C's, is that it happens at a time when there's a disparity. There's always a disparity between which a culture is flourishing or not. The West was certainly flourishing in an imperial way in a lot of other ways in the 19th and 20th century, and they weren't particularly good. They weren't good centuries for the Chinese. The Manchu Empire was on its last legs, and it finally declines, falls apart, and then you really have China in chaos until the rise of the 1949 and the founding of the People's Republic of China, which is not a group, generally speaking, that has been particular. The Communist Party of China is not highly interested in encouraging interfaith dialogue. However, as the years have gone on, they actually have, and they've sponsored conference after conference. One of the most memorable ones, and one of the ones that is thought about as one of the kind of foundational ones in China, was actually held in the city of Chufu, which is Confucius's hometown, which being a small town in China means it's probably only 350,000 people. But that makes it a small town in China. So we began to have we had one of our first really big international events there. And as you can imagine, viewing or going around the area of Chufu is kind of like traveling in the Holy Land. You know, where every bush has an ancient history to it. You know, if any of you have been on tours of Israel and Palestine, you know, the tour buses will stop about every 100 yards to show you another site. The same way around Chufu. And I have a wonderful picture where Confucius is supposedly have been born in a little cave. And there is actually a little cave near this place, and so I have a picture of the little cave. Now, what has been fascinating, what has been really interesting about this dialogue is that it was allowed to begin again in the 1980s. The Chinese were allowed to participate. But most of the people, as you could imagine in the 1980s, things were changing in China, but it tended to be very historical. Unless you happen to be an overseas Chinese, that is to say somebody who is living permanently in the West, none of the Chinese there could actually confess to be Confucian. Though nowadays they can. So that led to a whole number of conferences that have been held in China and elsewhere on Confucian Christian dialogue. Now, what makes it different from so many of the other dialogues that I've been involved in is that Confucianism is in, I think, more transformation now than any of the other traditions. You have 19th century, and I often liken it to, all right, what happens to the captain of the ship? The Confucians are the captains of the ship of China, and it runs aground the West and damn near sinks. So a lot of people are saying, like, we've got to get rid of that captain. Of course, in the initial decades of the People's Republic of China, Confucianism could only be studied by very, very few, and then hardly any at all, in the universities there. And then it began to change. And people were allowed to go about doing Confucian studies. I'll have to tell you about one of the conferences that I found so revealing about contemporary China, because in a sense you didn't really know. It's like how do we run these things? So they're running this big international. They're running first a scholarly conference where there must be 60 or 70 of us at the conference site at Chufu, very lovely conference site. So then we go into the city itself. We go into a larger city and go into a huge auditorium where they're having a cultural evening about Confucianism. So they're doing this, and the two people that they get to do the reading, and this really kind of like floored me, floored all of my friends. The two people they get to do this, they brought in two absolutely beautiful, Chinese actresses in full Western ball gowns, replete with, these, I don't know what you call them, but, the shoulder-length gloves, and they're doing the whole, they're doing the whole thing. They're doing the reading, and, I'm sitting, all my friends are sitting there, and they're thinking like, what would have Kunze made of this? Yet it was, I was actually incredibly impressed in the sense that, there were so many elements that they put into this. And of course my friends were saying, well, they didn't want to have just, they've had enough men speaking, so they wanted to have women, so that, they had this mixture, going on. Now, after the early 80s, then as Chinese universities have opened up, the whole kind of study of Confucianism and Christianity is now possible and flourishes in China. Many of you may know the great Professor Du Weiming, who taught at Harvard for decades and decades and decades. He's moved to China and is kind of the doyen of Confucian Christian studies. The question always is like, who do you have, there on the particular, who do you have there speaking for? Nowadays, I have found it very interesting in the last few years, the last couple times I've gone, people can identify as Confucians. And in fact, if you could be a Christian Confucian, you can be a communist Confucian. You could be a member of the CCP and deeply love the Confucian tradition. Again, what makes it interesting? Well, for somebody like me, all of it's interesting. The history of the people, whatever is happening, whatever going on, I find fascinating. But it's what are people going to make of the Confucian tradition? Now, I have to step back just a moment. In the People's Republic, it was very hard to study Confucianism, even though people would do it kind of on the side. But of course, it was done in great gusto in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So there are many very, very great contemporary scholars of Confucianism. Probably the most interesting philosophic case of this is a guy named Mo San. You'd love him. He was a great Kant scholar too. So he spent endless amounts of time translating Kant into Chinese. So you have people who are very, very interested in Western philosophy, know so much about it. They are good colleagues in conversation with their Western colleagues. And in fact, I find Chinese philosophy departments and intellectual history groups infinitely more cosmopolitan than their American brothers and sisters. Infinitely more cosmopolitan. When I go to China and I talk about Aristotle, they know who Aristotle is. I talk about Plato, they know who Plato is. They know who Heidegger is. And a lot of them like Whitehead, they like process thought. And my joke is, when I say Jushi, people don't know whether I'm talking about a person or I'm sneezing. Sneezing in the West. Western academicians and Western intellectuals, I think, have a huge way to go to catch up with I would say, the cosmopolitan sophistication of their Chinese colleagues. One of my Chinese friends has laughingly now said, "Oh well, not to worry. We're just going to have so much money. We're going to buy you all and then make you learn it anyway." There'll be a moment where people will begin to do this. So it's actually a really interesting time to do this kind of interfaith dialogue, because of the historic transformation of China. But then there are the other historic transformations too. For example, conferences, all these conferences that we held are completely gender inclusive. So to have women involved, both on the Chinese side and on the Western side, again, is something dramatically different than you would have seen 100 years ago. So I find in my collection at home some of the most interesting works are works now by contemporary feminist scholars on Confucianism. And rather like with every tradition, it's like a real equal war situation. All right, everything's been patriarchal for the last, 2.5 millennium, so the Confucians aren't any better, and probably no worse than anybody else. But, how do you then begin to bring in voices of women into the conversation? And I think that's along with the broad interest in Confucianism. Now, I'm sitting looking at something by Chinese women students here. It's adding voices that have never been there before. So it is a remarkably interesting time. I decided I would do a historical overview because I don't want to bore you with what I have written about some of the theological questions, but they're there. For instance, the whole question of what we might mean by religion or, for example, transcendence. Transcendence and immanence being incredibly important theological concepts in kind of philosophy, of metaphysical theology. But how do those translate themselves, for example, into Confucianism? And then how do you talk about that, with Confucians? For example, many Confucians would argue that, it's a tradition that does not privilege and is not even particularly interested in metaphysics. And I think that's true to an extent. So most of the topics and most of the ways that these conversations have gone about would be one of the areas with which a school like this, and certainly the Confucians, are fascinated by social ethics. What do we do about human relations? How do we understand the human mind-heart? Xin in Chinese means, when you talk about, in Chinese, the term that we would translate as mind is really the mind-heart, which I've always really liked. Because the notion is that none of our minds are just purely rational calculating machines. And in the Chinese sense, they've always been, rationality has been an integral part of the mind-heart, but it's also the heart and the emotions that you bring with it. And one of the tricks of self-cultivation is learning how to conjoin, how to coordinate the rational with the emotional. And again, that's nothing new to an audience like this. So I'm going to bring it to a conclusion there, and hopefully open it up, and I will have, you can either go back to sleep or go back to eating your lunches, or raise questions that have emerged either in your own reflections on Confucian-Christian dialogue, or hopefully some of the things that I have raised for us for conversation. So I want to open it up now to questions from the floor. Or does Dana wants to?
Let's let Dr. Wong speak. And then
Oh, right. I'm so sorry because he gets to do the formal response. So Shin, my deepest apologies.
let's give Dr. Berthrong.
And then Dr. Richard who's taught me so much.
Well, before we open it up for general conversation, we would just like to welcome Dr. Zhangxin Wang here to give a response or a small reflection on the work of Professor Berthrong. Dr. Wang is president of the Chinese Christian Scholars Association of North America. He's held many guest professorships in China, travels back and forth there, and is a leading intellectual. He is an editor of a series of volumes on Christianity and China, and has also written many works himself. So he's also an alum of our program, and so he was also a student of Professor Berthrong and of me. And so we'd like to, and is a visiting researcher with the Center for Global Christianity and Mission. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wong.
And for all you doctoral students, you see you can graduate.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. I just want to take this opportunity to reflect on my relationship with Professor John Berthrong. Believe it or not, Professor John Berthrong is the first professor I knew at Boston University. Then, back to about 24 years ago, when I first time came to this country, went to Hawaii for a summer school at the University of Hawaii for summer school, comparative study of religion. So that's my first time in this country. At that time, I was junior faculty at Peking University, Department of Philosophy, also religious study. I was teaching church history. However, I never studied Christianity or church history in China. I'm kind of self-taught. That teacher told the student, so it's funny. So at that time, I just want to take a chance to study Christianity in this country for a doctoral program. So one day I was at the Department of Religious Study at the University of Hawaii. I saw many brochures from School of Theology, Divinity School, all over US. So they have brochures. I saw School of Theology BU. So I asked Professor David Chappell, so who was the organizer of the summer school. I asked him, I want to go to a school to study Christianity. Which school you recommend me to go? So he very excited, he said, Boston University School of Theology. Why? He told me, Professor John Berthrong was my very good friend because Dr. David Chappell is also from Canada. So he recommended me to come here. So he write a recommendation letter to the school. So after I go back to China, I wrote a letter to Professor John Berthrong because Dr. David Chappell gave me Dr. Berthrong's contact information. So after a while, I received a letter from Professor Berthrong. So it's a very warm letter. So you feel there's not professor and students talk or just an administrator with applicants, but it's like a friend already knew for a long time. So he welcomed me, apply for this school, also tell me on his research field, also the school. So then I decided to go to this school. BU is the only school I applied for, not other schools. So then I got accepted. So I come here about 23 years ago. So I met Dr. Berthrong in person. He is very nice person, give me a lot of help me to understand Christianity, understand the comparative study, also the school, university culture, everything. So when I have a problem, question or difficulty, I always go to his office to ask him for help. So I really had a very good time at BU for 7-8 years that time. After I graduated from this school, I continued work very closely with Professor Berthrong. to develop a kind of China exchange program. So we brought here dozens Chinese professors from all over China that come here to study Christianity, comparative study of religion. Those professors are very well-known top professors in China, in today's China, that have a great influence in China. So Dr. Berthrong and I also went to China several times to visit universities, to attend conferences, also to deliver lectures at many schools. After those visits, several universities in China established a kind of exchange program with the School of Theology, like Central University, Beijing Language University. Also, you probably not know, Dr. Berthrong is a very big name in China, mostly in philosophy department, in Confucianism study field, in Chinese culture field. Many scholars, professors, they knew Bai Shina, that's Professor Berthrong's Chinese name, Bai Shina. So they all knew his work, his interest in Confucianism. So during my visit to those universities in China, many universities want to invite him to give lectures, give courses over there, but he's just too busy here. I hope maybe in the future, he will have a more time to go. So today I'm here. I just want to thank Professor Berthrong for his contribution to our university, our school, our China program, exchange program, also for me to help me a lot. So I wish you have a great time in Vancouver, Canada. Also, don't forget to go to China. It's close. Yeah, thank you.
Well, now we have time for questions and discussion. So I'll invite Professor Berthrong to come back up and want to field your own questions.
Sure. I can start. First of all, I want to thank Professor Wong. He would often collect me at the airport. I don't know if he remembers, but there was one time where I was supposed to come in. If you've ever been to Beijing, it's a huge airport, so like many of them, it's got many different terminals. And I had this one time where I was like alone, and I was feeling really stupid because usually when I go to China or any international trip like that, I carry like a real kind of big Rolodex with me. But because I knew Professor Wong was there to collect me, I didn't even bother. So I'm standing there in the middle, about 45 minutes into this, kind of standing there with my bag and myself, and then thinking like, okay, I do know some other good colleagues in Beijing. I'm going to have to take off. And then I saw his happy, smiling face because I think he was happy to find me too. And so up he came, and then off, as he says, we went to do all of these kinds of dialogues that helped rage in China. That now flourish in the sense that Professor Wong is right, that the departments have changed so dramatically since the 1980s, and the study of religion, I mean, not just Christianity, but the intellectual study of religion flourishes in Chinese universities now. Whether or not you happen to be a believer, that's again, like here, in material, what is of great interest is the scholarly tradition, and of course there is no longer, well, I guess I'd have to say, Judaism and Confucianism are about the longest ongoing scholarly traditions the world has. And if I had some Indian friends here, some probably Indian friends would say, what about the Vedic traditions too? But thank you, Professor Wong. It's been such a pleasure to have him as a colleague.
From your experience, and forgive me if this is asked and answered, but what does Confucianism as an academic tradition have to bring to the American academic experience? What gift do you think it could bring that would either be most beneficial or is most lacking from our tradition?
Right now, actually, it's a really good question. I have to answer it from my own perspective.
Of course.
So, like, when you ask that kind of question, I'm sitting here thinking, like, it's a vast tradition, and it depends on, you know, where you come from in it. I find, you know, for example, the whole discussion of human nature, the nature of the mind, heart, and then how in Confucianism especially, well, in Confucianism paramountly, how this is always connected to the social life and social realities of the country. Now that's not alone. There are many religious traditions that do that, but Confucianism never lets you escape. Or actually even better, it always invites you. Let me say escape, it's not chasing you down. It invites you to think about how whatever philosophic concepts you're dealing with relate to yourself in terms of your own self-cultivation, in terms of the cultivation of the family, in terms of the cultivation of the community, the cultivation of the state, and the cultivation of the whole cosmos. So the Confucian tradition always will have, in many of them, like eight layers. And it doesn't matter where you start in them, you expand out from like self-cultivation to respect for the world and back, and Confucian will never ever let you forget the fact that your thought and your ideas and your philosophy are a social reality and need to be connected with the society in which you live and which you ought to nourish. And that continues today unabated. That's been a part of the Confucian tradition for centuries. Another thing I must say I like about Confucians is that Confucians never persecute anybody. There are not Confucians can be great generals. Some of the greatest generals in Chinese history have been Confucians, and they were perfectly capable of carrying out great military achievements. But the tradition itself, in the tradition there are two, there's Wen and Wu, and sort of one is like cultivated humanity, Wu would be like warfare. And the Confucian traditions have always argued the epitome of human life, we have to have conflict, we have to have police forces, we have to have armies, they have no problem with that. But from the Confucian point of view, it is the ruler that never has to use those who's the truly successful ruler. Now, today, I don't, how this is going to play out in contemporary China, I think is a very interesting phenomenon. And I would point out, now here, this would be an interesting point to talk about with my Chinese colleagues. You'll notice that the Chinese are traveling around the world, having an incredible international impact. They actually do own a few aircraft carriers that they've built, but they don't do it in the same kind of militarized way the United States does. For example, I would probably say the Chinese are infinitely more liked in Africa than Americans are. Why? Because they're doing this through trade, diplomacy, education. Not that they can't, Chinese, just like everybody else, can be arrogant if they want to. And of course, they do look back at this huge, incredible history and see it as a gift. But they see it as a gift to the world. And it is almost like a gift. And the ultimate gift in Chinese civilization is truly, I'm scribbling a little character for civilization 01. That is the peaceful cultivation of the self, of the family, of the community, of the world, and also, especially from the Neo-Confucians on to the whole cosmos. And that is, if they could convince more people of that, that'd be all the better. And that would be within China, having kind of Confucianism or that Confucian strain within China, win out over other things that go on in contemporary China as well.
Professor, I wonder, do you have any short-term or long-term plan for your future research? And are there any specific area or question that you will focus on?
Oh, yeah, I do. I have a kind of a 2-3 part of that. I'm looking at two great eras of the Confucian tradition. So I'm going back and I'm looking at Xunzi. And within Confucianism, Xunzi is the bad boy of the early classical Confucians because he says nasty things about Mencius, who's the second sage. So he's a genius, but he tends to get written out. Now people are doing it. So I'm looking at Xunzi and Juxi, and then I'm asking a comparative question about, having made those kinds of classical, early modern comparisons, what does that tell us about human nature, and how might that then enter into dialogue with various forms of Western philosophy and Western theology? So yeah, I've got a slightly ambitious research project. And any of you know anything about that, you can do all kinds of little bits and pieces of it. You don't do it all at once. Other questions?
Jefferson, to what extent, I mean, there's obviously been a lot of conversation in the West and in the East as well about sort of global fundamentalism, not just in Judaism and Christianity, but Hinduism, Buddhism. To what extent, I'm trying to find a good way to word the question, but to what extent is Confucianism able to resist sort of those movements towards fundamentalism? Or are there aspects of Confucianism that can succumb to fundamentalism?
There are, I think, but on the whole, Confucians are taught to be open to everyone. To greet everyone with an open hand, and that you can learn from people from all different kinds of religious backgrounds. So Confucianism grew up in a world in which there were other great traditions, for example, Taoism, the other great indigenous Chinese tradition, then Buddhism. So that in some ways, the Confucian tradition has been a kind of an ecumenical and interfaith, it's lived in kind of an ecumenical and interfaith reality that I don't think a lot of Christians, I hate to say that, but you know, it's sort of built into the tradition that you're interested in other traditions, especially Taoism and then Buddhism and now contemporary Christianity. And it's as long, you know, if it's done in a friendly way with an open hand, Confucians are delighted to do so. There's nothing that need be hostile in that. Now, you know, for instance, Confucians are very aware of the fact. Now, Confucians have actually, in the early period and other periods, people say, is it an atheistic tradition? It's kind of an agnostic. So, for example, one thing Confucians do find fascinating talking to Christians about, at the kind of level that I deal with university professors, is they find it fascinating to listen to sophisticated Christians talk about their version of theism. It's like, oh, this is a lot more sophisticated than you guys just have a white bearded guy on a mountain somewhere. You know, there is a really, sophisticated religious vision that we can find I mean, they could have found it in other traditions, but they find it in conversations with Christians. And they find that very interesting because there's nothing that keeps a Confucian from being a theist. A Confucian, you can be a theistic Confucian without violating anything in the tradition. Now, also the idea, because they've always had this Buddhist-Taoist connection, there's nothing in the tradition that keeps people from thinking about being Confucian Christian or Christian Confucian either. That kind of sense of harmony that you could be both. They can consider that. That tends to unnerve Westerners. I mean, especially Western Christians or other. Like you have to be one or the other. Well, from this long ongoing dialogical sense of tradition, there's not necessarily a feeling that has to be. So I have friends who consider themselves both good Confucians and good Christians. Even though that they know that doesn't play particularly well amongst, say, Christian colleagues, unless they happen to be liberal Christian colleagues from a place like Boston University. Oh, couldn't see the hand down there.
Sort of picking up on this. So many of the early translations of Confucian texts into English were undertaken by Christian missionaries.
Exactly.
And one would expect that a Christian filter was part of those translations. And so in other words, part of how the tradition was received here was sort of with a rose-colored, Christian-colored glass
Yeah.
over it slightly. Is there anything you would name or characterize that you think it would be important for Christians to unlearn about what they might have picked up about Confucianism back in the day? From old translations that they may have been exposed to, because who knows where we all picked it up.
Yeah, exactly. And internally you also find that too. The greatest translator, and probably still today, is a great man by the name of James Legge, L-A-G-G-E, and his translations are still read. And he started out being pretty hostile to he did the translations, he did all of this work so that you could convert the Chinese, and yet in his later work there's this most remarkable, I wish I could pull it out, I've quoted it many times. He's got the most beautiful footnote to one of the translations where he says, the longer I've gotten to know this material, the more I've actually grown to love it. And then he goes on. So here is a person who starts out. You translate and study in order to convert. Now, James Legge was still a convinced Christian and hoped to pick up the gospel, but he would then see it as a gift. But he also saw there was gifts coming back. So you would see that in a lot. There's the greatest Scottish missionary is a guy named Timothy Richards. And there's a wonderful story where Timothy Richards is in Shanghai for a big conference. And a bunch of young American missionaries have shown up. And they kind of noticed that this guy has been pushed aside. He's been kind of excluded from the missionary conference. And he has a wonderful line. They look at him and they say, well, we've been talking to you and our Chinese friends, and you are, why are they doing that? And this guy, Timothy Richards, has one of those lines I wish I could have thought of. It's one of those lines, it's just so funny. He says, well, the difference is I can read and speak Chinese, they can't. And basically what he was saying is that so many of these people, the people that were hostile to him, might have lived in Shanghai for 20 or 30 years and couldn't speak a word of Chinese, didn't know any Chinese. They had simply lived there and then they'd worked through translators. So I love that line. He says, well, the big difference is that, they'd be a little better off if they could actually read it and speak it. They'd have a deeper, they might actually grow to have a certain kind of appreciation for it. Even though Timothy Richard never gave up being,
Christian.
Actually, he was a missionary, but at the end of his kind of life, he said, gee, I hope I didn't convert anybody. And by that he meant he hoped he hadn't browbeaten anyone. He wanted to present, from him the gospel was a gift. And you presented it, so, in that sense, like, I've converted somebody because I paid for their college education or their kids' college education or this or that. He really wanted to avoid that. Fascinating guy, Timothy Richards. What's the difference? I can speak and read Chinese. And it still happens today, too. Other questions?
Let's just take one or two more.
Okay. I think the topic is very interesting because my American friends asked what we can bring from Confucianism to American academia. And in China, most of Chinese scholars talks about what we can bring from Christianity to Chinese academia. So the context is extremely different. Even in contemporary China, the rule of Confucianism is really controversial.
Yeah.
Not everybody endorses this tradition as the backbone of Chinese culture. And sometimes, most of the time, when you talk about some Chinese Christian, they are really conservative. They think Christianity is the icon for the advanced Western culture, and Confucianism is just the one to symbolize the backwardness of traditional China. So most of the time, the inter-religious dialogue become an intra-religious dialogue. That means just bring Confucianism here to prove Christianity is more advanced than Confucianism. So that brings a question: what is the appropriate methodology to do inter-religious dialogue? Could we, either as a scholar or as a religionist, to get rid of this lens of faith, to have impartial and objective comparison between different traditions, or we must, stick to our original faith and then open to the others? So since I am your student, we always talk about this kind of question. Can you give a nutshell about your methodology to do the interreligious dialogue?
I think it's actually the key to it, the way I understand it, is trying to let yourself be as open to the other tradition as possible. And that is so, I'm constantly struck how hard that is to do, because you're working across in between two great cultures, and you're working, for example, I'll work in English and Chinese, and you're working between two incredibly different kind of languages and language families. So I still try to remind myself all the time to be as open as I can be, and to let my mind be changed if it needs to be. It needs to be changed. And as I say right now, some of the most interesting things that I find I'm reading now are women scholars writing about both Christianity and Confucianism, but also writing about interreligious dialogue, because they bring a whole, often a different perspective to it, as do people from different traditions too. So it's that attempt to always be open and not be dogmatic, which is easy. I find it's easy to do, because whenever I find myself tending to do that, I just think how vast both traditions are and how little I know. And that, all right, so maybe that's false humility. But I cast my mind over it and think about, well, I just know little bits and pieces of both. And so that anyone who brings something new to me is bringing something new to me that I need to think about. And that's an endless task.
Let's see, is there one more question? Well, if not, please join me in thanking
And I'll get
Professor
to, in Chinese,
Berthrong
since I can thank all of you.